The occupation of France during the Second World War was a trying time. Liberating the country became a priority for the Allied forces, and efforts were made to disrupt German operations and put Allied troops on the ground to help retake control. Some of the biggest contributors to France's liberation, however, weren't riflemen, but railwaymen. Many people in France weren't exactly happy that Germany had decided to occupy them, and naturally underground movements formed to fight back and sabotage German operations. Railways have played a major part in most wars since their invention, as their ability to move massive amounts of heavy equipment and people relatively quickly can make or break the tides of battle. Naturally, they became significant strategic targets during the war, and nobody was more aware of this than those who worked on the railways themselves. Small resistance groups here and there would attack German convoys or interfere with operations, but when word spread that the Allies were planning on landing in France, efforts greatly increased to sow as much confusion and disorder as possible. Acts of rebellion came in all shapes and sizes, the most common one being to delay important trains. Drivers would call in sick or suddenly injure themselves when summoned. Those who did turn up to work took their time filling out paperwork and gathering equipment before they even touched their engine. When inspecting wagons, workers made sure to thoroughly examine them and note every fault they found, often leading to some trains having to be moved and shunted around in order to get rid of damaged rolling stock. Some wagons would also mysteriously become uncoupled from the rest of the train when nobody was looking. Firemen preparing engines for service would neglect the fire, resulting in locomotives not properly building a full head of steam before departing, and after setting off, drivers would run the engine as slowly as they could, open valves to drop the engine's boiler pressure, stop at every opportunity, and damage parts of the engine through careless driving so as to put it out of service when the journey was over. When filling locomotives with water, crews would either not fully fill the water tanks or leave release valves open to quickly drain them while operating, requiring them to frequently stop for refills. And it wasn't just engine crews that delayed services in this way, but signalmen too and station staff would set signals to stop at any given opportunity. Points and switches would be set the wrong way, sending trains into sidings or miles from their intended destination, and in some rare cases, signals would be set to all clear with the intention of crashing one train into the back of another. But delaying trains can only do so much, especially when angry German officers would threaten workers who were slacking or taking too much time. That's when the more daring acts of sabotage began. Subtle acts of vandalism involved cutting brake lines, tampering with rolling stock, and damaging locomotives. Workers in shunting yards would open valves on fuel tankers or break the locks on goods vans so their loads couldn't be properly secured. When engines were being prepared for service early in the mornings, some firemen would go engine to engine and drop the fire from the firebox. Steam locomotives take a long time to heat up, but cool down quite quickly. So their fire going out for even a few minutes could mean another hour of waiting before they were ready to work. Electrified parts of the network were also sabotaged too. The locomotives themselves weren't the easiest to sneakily damage, but they could be stopped by either cutting the overhead wires, destroying line-side power stations, or if you just wanted to delay the train, flip a switch and turn off the overhead power supply for a few minutes. Spare parts for engines being repaired were stolen, water towers and coaling stages were put out of order, and even turntables were deliberately jammed so engines couldn't be removed from sheds. All of this came with a great risk of being caught and heavily punished, but it wasn't just practical sabotage that was dangerous. Bureaucratic interference, such as important paperwork being lost or indefinitely delayed, played a massive part in messing with German military operations. The people working in railway offices were perhaps some of the most important members of the resistance, as they knew the contents of arriving and departing trains, where they were going, and how significant they were. This information would then be passed down to active fighters who could from there formulate more intricate plans to sabotage them. Office workers would also give rolling stock the wrong departure and destination labels, and so vital supplies needed on the front lines ended up in the middle of nowhere, and empty wagons would be sent to army bases. In 1944, as plans for the Normandy landings were being put into motion, the Allies managed to provide resistance fighters with explosives for breaching tracks, and essentially gave orders to wreck as much military equipment as possible. Initially, the explosives were used to blow out sections of rail, but was found to be ineffective compared to simply just unbolting the track and bending it out of position. Once the rails were displaced, men would wait beside the line with guns and attack supply trains that either stopped or derailed. The Germans quickly got wise to this and began creating no-go zones around important railway lines, tearing up trees and shrubbery beside the line and forbidding anyone from approaching the tracks unless permitted, going as far as to kick people out of their homes that just happened to be beside the railway. This made armed ambushes much more difficult, but not impossible. To help get fighters to where they were needed without detection, engine drivers would let them hide aboard their trains wherever they would fit. In animal containers, under boxes and luggage, and in steam locomotives, they'd even climb inside the tender's water tank. Not just fighters, but spies and escaped prisoners would be hidden like this too in order to get them in and out of danger. As D-Day approached, rebel attacks became increasingly bold. The explosives intended for breaching rails were used to blow up locomotives, points and switches were jammed with wood, stones, or just about anything you could get your hands on, and drivers flat out started crashing their engines deliberately. Resistance members would inform drivers in the know about rails they'd sabotaged in advance, and drivers would make sure to set their engine to full speed before jumping off the footplate when approaching these broken rails. Some drivers didn't even need an excuse, they'd just find an empty train and when nobody was looking, throw back the reverser, open the regulator and watch it roll away. It was an especially effective tactic if a train had already derailed on the line ahead, as slamming another load of wagons into the wreck would not only take longer to clear, but also put more engines and wagons out of service. Places like busy main lines, shunting yards, and even locomotive sheds ended up getting jammed with wrecks, and when rail cranes were ordered to clear up the mess, efforts were made to send them as far away as possible. With the rail network in such chaos, especially around Normandy, the Allies were able to successfully land while the German forces were struggling to get equipment, troops, and supplies where they needed to be. The sabotage continued until the Allies finally had access to France's railway network. After that, suddenly sick drivers became well again, spare parts were found for broken engines, and damaged tracks were swiftly put right. As bold and fantastic as these acts of espionage were, they weren't without consequence. Railway workers and rebels alike caught in the act were arrested and heavily punished. Over 150 members of Resistance Faire were shot after being caught, and a further 500 were deported, many of them dying during transportation. That's also not taking into account the amount of fighters who died during ambushes and sabotage attempts, and the countless others injured. Nonetheless, their perseverance, bravery, and defiance to fight in the face of oppression certainly makes their story worth remembrance. War is a trying time for all, but let this be a reminder that in the fight against evil, not every fight is on the front lines, and that everyday people with nothing more than the tools of their trade can be just as important in the battle against oppression as those armed with guns. Subscribe for more.